Today we're out in the woods taking a look at the all-new 2017 Kia Niro. This is closely related to the Hyundai Ioniq series of vehicles, and this is the most efficient crossover available in the United States. Of course, there's been a great deal of debate about whether or not the Niro is really a crossover, and we will get to that in just a bit. The last time we took a look at the Niro was in San Antonio, Texas, and I was driving primarily the top-end touring trim, which is rated for 43 miles per gallon. However, this week we got our hands on the most efficient version of the Niro, the base FE trim, and this is rated for 50 miles per gallon. Whether you want to call the Niro a crossover or a hatchback or a hybrid of those two types of vehicles, this is without a doubt the most efficient vehicle in either category. The Niro is instantly recognizable as a Kia because we have this tiger nose shape right here on the front grille. That's what they call the shape defined by this chrome strip. Because we're driving the base FE trim, the front end looks just a little bit different than some of the other trims because we don't have fog lamps right down here. We have LED strips right here inside the headlamp module, and these are halogen headlamps, although HIDs are available in top-end trims. From this angle, the Niro definitely looks like a crossover. We have the same sort of styling in this rear zone that we find in other compact and subcompact crossovers in America. This doesn't overtly look like a hatchback like a Volkswagen Golf, and it doesn't look like a station wagon either. The Niro offers 6.3 inches of ground clearance, which is identical to what you find in the Toyota RAV4, perhaps the quintessential compact crossover. But very importantly, the Niro does not offer all-wheel drive, even as an option, and that is something you typically find in the average crossover in America. Obviously, crossovers like the Jeep Cherokee will offer significantly more ground clearance than the Niro, but they're also available in a front-wheel drive format. The tricky thing with calling the Niro a crossover is that there is no standard definition for what a crossover is. Generally speaking, a crossover is a vehicle that blurs the line between car and SUV. And if you consider an upright seating position and a dashboard and an overall shape that looks more like a little SUV than a sedan, then this is a crossover. Of course, we still don't have all-wheel drive, and that may be a sticking point for some folks. Even though it's been some time since I first experienced the Niro out in San Antonio, I'm no closer to answering the question of, is this a crossover for myself? Therefore, the question I proposed to all of you earlier still applies. If you were to buy a front-wheel drive version of the RAV4 or a front-wheel drive Jeep Cherokee, is it no longer a crossover? If you were to buy a rear-wheel drive version of a Jeep Grand Cherokee, is that no longer an SUV? Regardless of what you want to call the Niro, this is 171.5 inches long. That puts this right between the Kia Soul and the Kia Sportage in terms of overall length. That means this is about 2 inches longer than the Honda HR-V, which is a subcompact crossover, admittedly one of the larger subcompacts, but it is still shorter than that Sportage, which is one of the smaller compact crossovers in America, and notably shorter, nearly 10 inches or so, versus the Honda CR-V. Out back, the look is definitely modern two-row crossover. We have a rear window that is very slightly raked, more upright metal section of the rear hatch. The model that we're driving uses halogen tail lamps. All the other versions of the Niro use LED tail lamps. They put the backup lights down here lower on the bumper, and then they integrate the backup camera very nicely right here in the rear windshield wiper. Under the hood, we have the latest Kia hybrid drivetrain. This was co-designed with Hyundai, and it's essentially the same one that you'll find under the hood of the regular hybrid Ioniq. The 1.6-liter four-cylinder Atkinson cycle engine produces 104 horsepower and 109 pound-feet of torque all on its own. It is then mated to an AC electric motor that produces 43 horsepower and 125 pound-feet of torque. Together, the electric motor and the gasoline engine combine to give you 139 horsepower and 195 pound-feet of torque. That's about the same kind of power that we find under the hood of the Toyota Prius, which is logical because the Niro's mission is a little bit closer to the Prius and perhaps the Prius hatchback than your average crossover. Some of you may be scratching your heads because 104 plus 43 does not equal 139, and 109 plus 125 doesn't equal 195. The reason for that is that the electric motor and this gasoline engine don't produce their peak horsepower and peak torque at the same time, but where those two lines cross, that's where we get the 139 and 195 pound-feet. Backing up the hybrid system is a lithium-ion battery pack just under 1.6 kilowatt hours in overall storage. That's about 17% larger than we see in the Toyota Prius. Kia has already announced that in a few months we will also be getting a plug-in hybrid version of the Niro, and that will use a larger 8.9 kilowatt hour lithium-ion battery pack and a larger 60 horsepower electric motor. The larger motor and the bigger battery pack should give the Niro about 25 to 30 miles of electric-only range. You might be wondering why the Niro has 3 different fuel economy ratings, 50, 49, and 43 depending on the trim. The approximate 14% loss between the 50 mile per gallon trim, which is the one that we're driving right now, versus the 43 mile per gallon trim, which is the one we drove before, is very logical when you think about it. Not only is this base trim about 200 pounds lighter than the top end trim because we don't have all the same gadgets, features, options, etc., but this is also the most aerodynamic. You'll notice we don't have any roof rails right up here, and we have much skinnier tires. The addition of the fog lamps and the addition of the roof rails, which again take away from the aerodynamics of the vehicle, are the primary reason this is 1 mile per gallon better than the next trim up. But by the time we get to the top end trim, they've added 200 pounds of goodies to the car and they've given it 225 with tires. Tire size has a huge impact on fuel economy because as you enlarge the contact patch of the tire with the ground, you improve handling, you improve your braking scores, but you decrease your efficiency. Of course, the Kia engineers have worked as hard as possible to use low rolling resistance tires that try and balance out handling to efficiency, but you're still going to get better handling in the top end trims of the Niro, but you will give up that efficiency. A 7 mile per gallon drop from 50 to 43 just from jumping from one trim to the other seems massive. However, when you take a look at this as a percentage, it makes a little bit more sense. Because at this end of the fuel economy scale, we're talking about bigger numbers. But if you look at your average crossover out there, you will see a 1 to 2 mile per gallon difference from the top end trim to the bottom end trim. But when you're only talking about 20 miles per gallon to 21 or 22, it doesn't seem like that big of a jump. Front seat comfort comes in at 8 out of 10 points if you get the model that we're driving right here. We do have the manual seat with no adjustable lumbar support, but we do have a tilt telescopic steering column with a large range of motion, and the seating position is fairly upright. The available power driver's seat also incorporates a two-way adjustable lumbar support, and I'm going to give that seat 9 out of 10 points. Unlike your average hatchback and more like your average crossover, headroom is fairly generous. Sitting in a fairly upright position, I still have about 2 inches of headroom left. We are in the model without the optional sunroof. Rear seat comfort comparisons are a little bit tricky. It really depends on what you want to compare this to. We have more headroom than we find in our average compact or subcompact hatchback. Sitting upright, I still have about 2 inches of headroom back here, but we don't have quite as much combined legroom, that's front row plus second row, as some of the larger compact crossovers. The Niro delivers 79.1 inches of combined legroom, which is just about the same size as the larger Kia Sportage. And that means that sitting right here behind myself, I have about 3 inches of legroom left. But you will find a little bit more in a CR-V. The rear seats are definitely more spacious and more comfortable, especially in terms of headroom versus your average compact or mid-size sedan. This also is much more generous than your average subcompact crossover. Although the Honda HR-V is very generous in terms of overall legroom, all of the other subcompact entries are definitely more cramped in the back. The Niro is not quite as wide as a RAV4 or CR-V, and it is a bit obvious when you try and stick 3 adults in the back seat. The cargo area in the Niro is just about the same size as the HR-V, the Kia Soul, the Ford C-Max, or the Toyota Prius. But unlike the Toyota Prius, this cargo area is a little bit more square, which is exactly what you'd expect out of a crossover. That means when it comes to our exclusive 24-inch roller bag test, I was able to fit 5 of these back here in the cargo area. Because we're driving the efficiency trim, we don't have a spare tire, although there is just about enough room for a very compact model. We do have some additional storage space right back here, as well as the tire inflator and tow kit. When it comes to our exclusive trunk comfort index, I'm going to give this 8 out of 10 points. We do find a little bit less cargo room back here than an HR-V or a Soul, but definitely more than you'll find in something like a Mazda CX-3. Keep in mind that the Niro is smaller than a RAV4 or a CR-V, and that's why we find significantly less cargo room right back here in the rear. Although you'd be surprised that you won't find that much more space in a Jeep Cherokee or Kia's own Sportage. As we take a look around the inside, keep in mind that we are in the base trim, which is the efficiency trim. We have height adjustable seat belts for the driver and the front passenger, two-way adjustable headrests, and one thing worth noting is that in the rear passenger compartment, we don't find cup holders, although we do have bottle holders in the rear doors. A nice touch back here is that the shoulder belt for the center seating position comes out of the seat back itself, not out of the ceiling. That definitely makes it a little bit handier for child seats or passengers alike. The seats in the FE trim use these 2 coordinating fabrics, with the center section having that interesting pattern right there. They are neither heated nor ventilated in this particular trim, although those options are available in other trims of the Niro. The front doors actually have more soft touch plastics than we typically find in a hybrid, so we have a soft touch upper section and a soft touch insert right there on the armrest, large storage cubby right down there with the bottle holder by the speaker grill. Taking a quick pan across the interior, you'll notice that this definitely has more of a crossover feel than your typical hatchback or compact sedan. The upper portion of the dashboard uses a soft touch injection molded component. Then we have this metallic effect trim, 2 air vents on either side with open and closed valves. And then we have a moderately sized bin style glove compartment. I was able to fit a small tablet computer inside, but not a full-size iPad. There are 2 different infotainment systems offered in the Niro. Because we are in the base trim, we have a 7-inch touchscreen infotainment system. This is standard. The software is substantially similar between the 7-inch and the optional 8-inch color touchscreen, and both offer Apple CarPlay and Android Auto. This is a really nice touch because it effectively means that all versions of the Niro come standard with factory navigation as long as you have a smartphone that's compatible. The system also offers USB and Bluetooth integration, and of course we have our typical hybrid screens so you can see where the power is going, flowing through the vehicle. We get an eco driving score right here. It's number 1 because we've been sitting here parked with the engine idling, and fuel economy, which is resettable. Top end trims will of course also have available factory navigation. Below the LCD we have the controls for the infotainment screen. We have some direct access buttons to phone that will actually take you to the CarPlay phone interface because we have CarPlay connected at the moment. We also have direct access to apps and the UVO e-services interface. Below that we have a dual zone climate control system with a driver only option which helps improve efficiency. Below the 2-zone climate control we have a storage cubby where you'll find 2 12-volt power outputs, a USB input, and an auxiliary input. Kia prefers to put very traditional controls in their hybrids. So we have a traditional console shifter. Drive is all the way down here towards the driver. We pull to the left for a sport mode, and then we can press up and down for the manual gear shift mode, which is quite unusual in a hybrid. We press away from the driver for up, pull towards the driver to change the gear down. And this is one of the truer manual modes. So if you're in 6th gear and you floor the vehicle, it won't downshift for you automatically. Between the front seats, we have 2 large cup holders, a slot right here where you can put smartphones, wallets, that sort of thing. We have a softly padded center armrest with a deep storage cubby. On the driver's side, we have an instrument cluster that's a little bit different than the other Kias in the US. We don't have a red needle, and we have this white ring around the black face. On the left side of the instrument cluster, we find our charge, eco, and power gauge, which is pretty typical in a hybrid. We then have a battery charge display right here, high and low, and then a fuel gauge. In the middle of everything, we have a color multifunction display, which gives you things like your fuel economy since you last reset the system, your driving style, as well as media information, tire pressure, and the ability to change certain vehicle settings. Because we're driving the base trim, we have a urethane steering wheel instead of a leather-wrapped steering wheel, although it still has the sport grips right up top. On the left side of the wheel, we have a voice command button, mode button. We can mute the system by pressing the volume toggle right in, and then we have dedicated phone buttons below that. The right side of the steering wheel is where we find the cruise control buttons and the button and toggles that control that multifunction display right there between the gauges. With just under 140 horsepower under the hood, you shouldn't expect lightning acceleration, and indeed we don't get it. We ran from 0 to 60 in 9.5 seconds, which puts this about 1/10 of a second behind the last Toyota Prius that we tested, just about equal with the Honda HR-V. The model that we're driving was also a hair faster than the last Niro that we tested at the launch event, likely because this is about 200 pounds lighter than that top-end trim. The most likely reason that this is a little bit slower than the Toyota Prius is because we have about 100 to 200 pounds of extra curb weight depending on how you have comparably equipped your Prius to this model. Something like a Ford C-Max, which you could also compare to the Niro, is definitely faster at 7.7 seconds 0 to 60 because we get significantly more power out of its hybrid system. In terms of overall acceleration, there are a number of subcompact crossovers that are right around this 9.5 second 0 to 60 time, not just the Honda HR-V. But your average compact crossover, and that would be a RAV4 or a CR-V, that segment tends to be about a second faster 0 to 60. So this vehicle is notably slower than something like Kia's own Sportage or a Kia Soul Turbo, depending on how you want to compare this on either end of the size scale. In our braking tests, we stop from 60 miles an hour to 0 in 122 feet. It goes down to 118 feet if you get the top end model because we get those much wider tires. The tire size on the model that we're driving right here is a 205 sectional width tire that is notably wider than a Toyota Prius, but it's definitely narrower than the top end model. As I said earlier, tire size has a huge impact on fuel economy, and that's why we see such a big difference between the top-end Touring trim and the bottom-end FE trim that we're driving right here. That's also likely why we see such a difference between this and the Toyota Prius, but those efficient trims of the Toyota Prius are using 195 width tires, and so there's definitely some sacrificing of handling ability in order to get that fuel economy. Therefore, it should be no surprise that the handling score ranges from a B+ to an A- depending on the version of the Niro that you get. Something like a Mazda CX-3 is going to be a little bit more engaging out on the road. Something like a Honda HR-V is going to be a little bit less engaging than the Niro. Comparisons are a little bit tricky with this vehicle, of course, because this logically competes with something like a C-Max, which they're not billing as a crossover. It definitely has a more relaxed driving position, more like a traditional hatchback. But you could also logically compare this to a Honda HR-V or Kia's own Sportage. The suspension tuning in the Niro lies somewhere between these two categories as well. The vehicle has overall a little bit more body roll, and the suspension feels a little bit softer than something like a Ford C-Max, but it also feels a little bit firmer than a Honda HR-V. This suspension is quite comfortable out on long car trips, but it doesn't soak up bumps quite as well as some of the softer crossovers with more ground clearance and more suspension travel. In our cabin noise test, this scored 72 decibels, which makes this quieter than a Prius or a Chevy Volt. Of course, like many hybrids out there, we seem to have a little bit less sound deadening in the wheel wells and under the vehicle. So if you're driving out on really rough road surfaces, you'll hear a bigger difference in terms of the overall cabin noise score than something like your average mid-size family sedan. Obviously, fuel economy is a major priority for the Niro, and we scored 52 miles per gallon over a week of very mixed driving. That's 2 miles per gallon better than the EPA says we should average. Keep in mind, we are of course driving the most efficient trim. If you get the next trim up, we'll see a reduction of 1 mile per gallon overall in the fuel economy, and if you get that top end trim, you'll end up right at 43. However, regardless of what you want to compare the Niro to, whether you want to compare this to a compact crossover, a subcompact crossover, your average hatchback, or some of those dedicated hybrid models out there, fuel economy is very impressive. So I'm going to give this a solid A. This is more efficient than a Ford C-Max, more efficient on gasoline than a Chevy Volt, but not as efficient as a Toyota Prius. The Prius in all versions will beat the Niro when it comes to fuel economy, and those most efficient versions of the Toyota will end up right around 59 miles per gallon in daily driving. Although the Prius takes the fuel economy crown, this is significantly more fuel efficient than the hybrid RAV4, the hybrid Nissan Rogue, or something like a Ford C-Max. Compared to the non-hybrid entries in the compact crossover or subcompact crossover segment, the fuel economy is a huge improvement. The Honda HR-V is one of the most efficient subcompact crossovers that we've tested, and it averaged 33 miles per gallon. So that's a significant difference between this and that HR-V. An interesting touch with this hybrid system is that the battery pack is about 20% larger than a Toyota Prius's battery pack, and the usable capacity seems to be even larger than that difference. That means that this hybrid system has a little bit more room, so on these long extended downhill runs, we can actually recharge the battery a little bit longer than the Toyota Prius. When regenerative braking, you'll notice one of the unusual things about this hybrid system. The power flow has to go through the wheels, back through the transmission in order to get to the electric motor. So as we're slowing down from whatever speed you're going to a complete stop, the transmission actually starts downshifting. And when we turn around and start hill climbing in electric-only mode, the transmission starts upshifting. That means that overall, the Niro feels more like a traditional automatic-equipped vehicle than your average hybrid, because we don't have that sort of rubber bandy feel that we do in a Prius or a C-Max or the Chevy Volt. For 2017, the Niro starts at $22,890, and that is for the FE trim that we've been driving this week. The two-ring model, which is what we tested at the launch event, and there's also a video on my channel about that, starts at $29,650. There's really only one option available. That will top you out at $31,550. The base price is a little bit higher than something like a Honda HR-V or a Mazda CX-3. However, we find much more standard equipment in the Niro, in addition to the standard hybrid system, than you find in the average subcompact crossover. As you'd expect from a vehicle that is smaller than the average compact crossover, the starting price tag is also smaller than something like a RAV4 or a CR-V. The top-end touring price tops out a little bit higher than many of the subcompact crossovers, although we find more luxury-oriented features in that top-end model than you find in your average subcompact. In terms of overall feature set, the Niro is a little bit closer to the average compact crossover. As we typically see with mainstream vehicles, the mid-level EX trim is the best value. It's also likely going to be the most popular, and that trim gets 49 miles per gallon, very much like the LX trim. That's only 1 mile per gallon hit versus the base model. Now let's move over to the pros and cons. Handling is surprisingly good for all versions of the Niro, and that's mainly due to the excellent suspension design that's also shared with the Hyundai Ioniq. The Niro has a fully independent rear suspension, which definitely separates this from the Kia Soul, which is one size step smaller in the Kia lineup. It's also a little bit different than some of the compact sedans that we see out there that you could logically compare the Niro to. Thanks to the suspension design that we see in the Niro and the related Hyundai Ioniq, the steering is a little bit numb, but the grip is good and the overall suspension design is very well poised even on broken road surfaces. A definite pro is the high fuel economy in the mainstream models. The EX trim, as I said before, only has a 1 mile per gallon hit versus that most efficient FE trim. As I said before, fuel economy drops notably if you move on up to the touring trim. That's thanks to those larger tires and all the other features that we get on the vehicle that add weight. The trade-off for the lower fuel economy really is handling, because it is notably better in that top-end touring model than in the lower-end trims. On the con side, acceleration isn't exactly swift in the Niro. Now, it's not that far off the Toyota Prius, but the Toyota Prius and the Kia Niro are going to be slower than your average compact crossover like a RAV4 or a CR-V. There are subcompact crossovers that will take just about as long to go from 0 to 60, of course. What you choose to compare the Niro to really will determine whether fuel economy is a pro or a con. If you compare the Niro against a Toyota Prius, then the fuel economy would be a con, because it's going to be lower than a Prius in real-world driving, especially if you get the top-end touring model. However, if you compare this to something like a Honda HR-V or a Mazda CX-3, then fuel economy is going to be a big pro. Now let's move on to comparisons, and these are a little bit tricky because you could compare the Niro to a wide variety of vehicles. Is the Niro a compact or subcompact hatchback? Or is it a front-wheel drive crossover? Or do you limit Niro comparisons to just hybrid models? Since I still don't have an answer to that question myself, I have picked a variety of vehicles for this comparison section. Let's start off with the Ford C-Max. The Ford C-Max comes easily to mind because it is a very similar shape to the Niro, although when you put them side by side, it's obvious that the C-Max is more of a hatchback and the Niro is trying to look more like a crossover. It's also obvious when you take a look at the seating position. It's a little bit more relaxed. The interior is a little bit more car-like inside the C-Max, and inside the Niro, things are a little bit closer to Kia's more upright crossovers. Base versions of the Ford C-Max will handle better than base versions of the Niro, even though the C-Max is 300 to 500 pounds heavier than the Niro. That's mainly due to the excellent suspension design that we find in the Ford and, of course, the wide tires that we find on the base model. But by the time we've worked our way on up to the touring model, the tire size is relatively similar, and the Niro still weighs about 300 pounds less than the Ford C-Max. That really puts the handling on more equal footing. Although the Ford C-Max is a hair more engaging, the Kia Niro actually holds the road just a little bit better in our tests. Cargo space is essentially identical between the two vehicles, but the Niro is a little bit higher off the ground. Fuel economy is the biggest difference between the two models, because the last few times we've driven the C-Max, we had troubles getting better than high 30s in terms of overall fuel economy. And in the Kia Niro, you can easily get 50 miles per gallon if you're driving that most fuel-efficient trim. Most of the versions of the Niro will end up in the mid-40s. Driving style obviously plays into this heavily, but the Niro is going to be around 10 miles per gallon better than the Ford C-Max in most situations. Of course, the C-Max is more powerful, so it's going to get you from 0 to 60 faster. That's likely why we see that difference in terms of economy. Now let's take a look at the Honda HR-V subcompact crossover. This is a very logical cross-shop with the Niro. The HR-V is going to be between $1,000 and $3,000 less expensive than the Niro, but you're going to find less feature content in the base HR-V than you find in the Kia. Most notably, the manual transmission is standard in that base model HR-V. We don't get dual zone climate control, some of the other features that we find even in the base model of the Niro. Acceleration isn't that far off between the Honda and the Kia, but the fuel economy difference is pretty large. You'll actually save about $550 a year in a 15,000 mile a year driving cycle if you bought the Kia over the Honda. That would mean if you're paying $1,000 extra for the Kia versus the Honda, you'll pay yourself back in just 2 years. The Kia is also going to be more comfortable inside the cabin, it has a more premium feeling cabin overall, and it handles notably better than the Honda HR-V. When it comes to actual ground clearance, the two vehicles are very, very similar, although obviously you don't find all-wheel drive in the Kia. You could also logically compare the Niro against some of these smaller compact crossovers like the Hyundai Tucson. The Tucson offers about 10 cubic feet more cargo space, and a lot of the prices end up very similar, although you will find more feature content in the Niro than in the comparably priced Tucson. Again, all-wheel drive is not available in the Niro, but it is available in the Tucson, so if you want all-wheel drive, the Niro will not be an option for you there. However, it's worth noting that the Tucson has only 1/10 of an inch more ground clearance than the Niro. There are actually a number of compact crossovers that have nearly identical ground clearance numbers to the Niro. When it comes to taking your car off the beaten path, ground clearance, all-wheel drive, and of course your tire selection all play important roles. In addition to that, if you're contemplating all-wheel drive because you drive your vehicle in a snowy area of the country, keep in mind that all-wheel drive alone will not help you handle better or stop faster in the snow. For optimum performance in snowy conditions, you do need dedicated winter tires, whether you're driving a front-wheel drive vehicle or an all-wheel drive vehicle. My personal preference in snowy areas of the country would actually be a front-wheel drive vehicle with dedicated winter tires on it rather than an all-wheel drive vehicle with all-season tires on it, because again, all-season tires are not going to stop as fast or handle as well as dedicated winter tires when the temperature drops below around 40 degrees or so. It's also worth noting that the cost difference between operating your Kia Niro and the average compact crossover is going to be much larger than the Honda HR-V. The Tucson will cost you about $750 more a year to operate than the Niro, again on a 15,000 mile a year cycle. The difference in the cost of operation is relatively similar whether we're talking about the Tucson or the new Jeep Compass or a RAV4 or a CR-V. Last up we have the Toyota Prius. The Prius C, which is their hatchback version, is about $2,000 less expensive than the Niro. The Prius V is the wagon version, it's about $4,000 more. The reason we're talking about the Prius, of course, is because hybrids make for strange comparisons. There aren't as many out there, not every vehicle comes with a hybrid version, so there's really no direct comparison for the Niro in that way. But because the Niro does have an advertised 50 mile per gallon version, and that's the one that we've been driving, logically the Prius comparison makes sense. The Prius can be between 10 and 17 miles per gallon more efficient than the Niro depending on how you drive it and depending on which models you're comparing. Although that sounds like an enormous delta, keep in mind that as we go on up the mile per gallon ladder, the actual cost difference to operate those vehicles shrinks. So when you're comparing the average configuration of the Niro to the average configuration of the Prius is only going to save you between $50 and $75 a year in terms of overall fuel costs. But there's definitely a price to be paid over on the Prius side. The Prius is not as fun to drive out on the road, even though the Niro is trying to be more of a crossover, more upright, it has its weight up higher. It actually handles better than the regular versions of the Toyota Prius. The Prius has more cargo room than the Niro, but the cargo area is shaped differently because the Prius is a liftback, the Niro is a hatchback, and it's trying to be more crossover-like, so the cargo area in the Niro is a little bit more upright. It really depends on what kind of cargo you plan on putting in each vehicle. Although the cargo area is smaller in the Niro, the overall shape of the vehicle has real advantages when it comes to carrying passengers. We find 2 inches more headroom in the back of the Niro than we find in the Prius, and 4 inches more legroom. Overall legroom, and that would be front row plus second row combined, is over 2 inches larger in the Niro than we find in the Prius. That really makes it more comfortable if you plan on carrying 3 or 4 people in your vehicle. Versus the average subcompact crossover, I think I would take the Kia Niro, as long as you didn't need all-wheel drive. The Niro gives you that crossover feeling inside while you're driving the vehicle, a more upright sitting position, and styling that is more crossover-like. Although it may be a little bit more expensive than some of the trims of compact crossover out there, the price tag compares very well, and you'll get significantly better fuel economy in the Niro. Comparing it to a compact crossover like a RAV4 or a CR-V, on the other hand, is a much tougher sell, because the Niro is just not as large, we don't have the same kind of ground clearance that we find in something like the new Honda CR-V, and of course there's no all-wheel drive. The Niro also compares very well if we narrow the pool way down to just hybrid models. Comparing the Niro to the Toyota Prius is actually quite similar to comparing the Niro to its very closely related Hyundai Ioniq. Therefore, my top pick in this convoluted review would be the 2017 Kia Niro, and I think my 2 runners-up would be the Mazda CX-3, which we did not talk about in our comparison section because it's an awful lot of fun, but it is also quite a bit smaller than the Kia Niro. And the other runner-up would be the Toyota Prius, because obviously if fuel economy is king for you, the Prius is going to be the way to go. Thanks for taking the time to check out this video. Again, I'm Alex Dykes, and this has been the 2017 Kia Niro. Be sure and check out those related videos you'll find on my channel. You can also head over to patreon.com and support this channel. And to find out what we're driving this week, find us over at facebook.com/AlexNautos. I'll see you next week.